Okay, so the case brought to us today involves individuals suing a company for damages caused by exposure to a BPA in their company's plastics. And in this case, the company should definitely be held liable for the damage they caused to the plaintiffs based on the epigenetic evidence provided by the plaintiffs. So epigenetics is a field of science that's just beginning to be accepted and understood by the scientific community. And the keywords there are accepted and understood. If you look epigenetics up in Google Scholar, you get over 220,000 scholarly papers, one of which, titled From Stem Cells to the Law Course by Caroline Relton, states that epigenetics is even being used as forensic evidence in some court cases. Another paper titled Transgenerational Tort Liability for Epigenetic Disease by Christopher Weeder states that damage to epigenome could even be evidence of damage in a liability case, and the perpetrator of that damage can and has been held liable in these cases. So in the specific case we're looking at today, individuals have sued because of damage to their epigenome when their mothers were exposed to BPH when they were pregnant with them. Several studies have shown a link between BPH exposure in pregnant mothers and damage to the mother's children and even grandchildren. For example, one of the studies titled Plastic-Derived Endocrine Disruptors Induce Epigenetic Transgenerational Inheritance of Obesity and Reproductive Disease by Mohan Madakam shows that when they exposed pregnant rats to BPA, their children and even their grandchildren had the side effects associated in their epigenomes from the BPA exposure. So what that means is the question here is no longer was there damage done to the epigenome by BPA, and is the damage to the epigenome considered evidence in a court case, but rather can the company be held liable for the damage? And in this case has already been outlined in the courts. In the case Grover versus Eli Lilly, it was stated that when a pregnant mother was exposed to a toxic chemical, if the child was also exposed in utero, and therefore the company can be held liable for the damage caused to that child in utero.
Okay, so going off that, it is immoral to continue to distribute a product that a company knows has negative effects on its consumers. The company should be held responsible in this case just based off the fact that BPA can cause negative effects on its consumers as well as its offspring. Tendorf stated that in the 1991 Federal Sentencing Guidelines for Organizations, they made ethics and complete programs a mitigating factor for sentencing corporate crime. So if a company could potentially serve crime for not upholding ethical and moral standards for their products and their consumers, then in this case, due to BPA plastics' negative effects on methylation in humans, these companies should do the same and be held responsible. BPA plastics have been linked to hypomethylation in the individuals of the offspring. Although the offspring have shown no symptoms of disease yet, that does not prove that the disease could not be manifested later in life. In an article written by Amir Eden, Francis Gaudet, Alpha Wayner, and Rudolf Tanisch, they studied the link between hypomethylation and chromosome instability. They studied this by doing, they exposed rats to BPA, and they studied the hypomethylation the tumor prone mice carried mutations, and they saw that they carried mutations in the tumor suppressor genes. Therefore, they came to the conclusion that DNA hypomethylation is linked to chromosomal instability, which can also lead to cancer, and they studied that further in humans. So, because we've discovered that hypomethylation can lead to increased risk of cancer and chromosomal instability in humans, and the company has the moral and ethical standards to uphold, in this case, the company should be held responsible for the BPA plastics' negative effects on individuals and their offspring.
I believe that the company should not be held responsible in this case and matter. To begin, I must say that for this case to have any standing in a court of law, more testing must be done in the field of toxicology research and just epigenetics as a whole. Starting with early developments in the utero-gastrulation stage is the most sensitive period of time for BPA exposure. Lab animals were put through tests and multiple toxicology assays and experiments, but none of the lab animals were pregnant at the time, like the plaintiffs were. There are also many differences between species being humans and primates versus lab animals and rodents that leave a lot of evidence and questions whether the species difference could have an effect on the results and data gathered here today. Also, primates metabolize and excrete BPA much more rapidly and efficiently than rodents do, and that raises the question of if the data should be re-examined or cross-examined to see if there's any linkage between the two, and there's no error within that. Studies conducted by the FDA's National Center for Toxicology Research found that BPA levels passed from mother rats to their offspring was practically immeasurable. Of course, this doesn't account for the species difference or the different variables within both experiments. However, it is important to note. With that, I would suggest that more transgenerational studies be done on humans to really narrow down the data that could be presented in this case for the plaintiffs to have any sort of standing. Also, the EPA requires companies to put out reports of their BPA levels to assure public safety. Now, the company did not go against any health and human safety violations, which raises the question of if the diseases brought on by the plaintiffs were affected by other environmental factors or just different things within their ancestry, or possibly the rate of BPA exposure versus the intensity of BPA exposure that could have been brought on by the companies. But for this case to have any sort of legal standing, more research is absolutely required in the field of epigenetics and toxicology research.
So the decision must also take into account the intentions of the manufacturer. So in the article Distributing Responsibilities, David Miller states that moral responsibility must involve the assessment of the agents or risks in the manufacturer's product and requires questioning of whether the manufacturer intended the outcome or facade. Also, not all victims are the same due to differences in epigenetic makeup, and this is because they were exposed to differences in environments, and some are more prone to developing disease than others. According to Rothstein et al., toxic chemicals and other harmful exposures are associated with poverty and substandard living and working conditions, thus they could be exposed to other harmful compounds and disease that cause them to develop disease. And the effects of BPA exposure have proven to be reversible through several studies. So for example, in a study done by Nolan et al., they found that maternal dietary supplementation was able to reverse hypomethylating effects of BPA due to hypomethylating effects of BPA on DNA with the maternal nutrient supplementation of methyl donors such as folic acid or phytoestrogen genistein. Thus, the mothers could have chosen to take these supplements in order to protect their offspring from the detrimental effects of BPA exposure.
You guys have a moment to prepare your rebuttals and get ready for that.
So that's like the same thing that I had before, only like said that more studies are needed to be done, but over 1,300 studies have been done on BPA and hypomethylation alone, and there are 53,000 studies on hypomethylation and epigenetic effects, and 190,000 on hypermethylation and epigenetic effects, with studies being published in Science on the front page as early as 2001 by Peter Jones and D. Takai. So it's been accepted for a while now, and stating that more needs to be done is fairly ridiculous. Furthermore, the NHS did a fertility study and found that men with the highest levels of BPA found in their urine compared with men with the lowest amount of BPAs found in their urine had 23% less sperm, and that was in humans and after they had been exposed in utero. Finally, the Canadian Cancer Society found that in utero exposure to BPA affects fertility and sperm, but they didn't find anything about cancer. So your point there is recognized, but fertility issues have been recognized in relation to in utero BPA exposure.
In a study published in the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, there's an article, bisphenol A exposure in utero leads to epigenetic alterations in the developmental programming of uterine estrogen response. And this study basically states that alterations of the HOXA10 methylation are linked to human cancers. And they did a study on mice because it's a lot easier to study the transgenerational effects on mice. And it says that the HOXA10 mRNA proteins increased by 25% in the reproductive tract of mice that were treated with BPA while in their mother's uterus. So clearly BPA can affect future generations.
As mentioned in The Ghost in Our Genes, authored by Rothstein, Pye, and Martin, companies have tried to take liability for toxins exposed to fertile women. In fact, Johnson Controls Incorporated enacted a policy called the Fetal Protection Policy that limited the exposure that fertile women had to lead, so that their blood, the amount of lead in their blood could not go above a certain level, so they were limited in where they could work. However, this case went to court, in fact all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it was ruled as sex discrimination. Not only did the court rule that this was discrimination, it was also ruled that it was the family's responsibility to limit exposure to toxins and not the company's job. So companies should not be held liable because it's the family's responsibility.
In addition, you guys mentioned the Lilly case that previously occurred several years ago. However, while that case definitely could be used as forensic evidence, this case is a little bit different to where the evidence provided here is not necessarily quite as linking. It doesn't link the companies quite as explicitly as the Lilly case does. For example, the defects that are seen in the plaintiffs today can be caused by quite a few other toxins, including BPA analogs. So recently, since there's been a lot of banning on BPA, there are now companies that are creating analogs of BPA, similar structure, but are different from BPA so they can get around regulations. However, according to a review published by the American Chemical Society, they found that these analogs are just as toxic as BPA of itself, and they produce similar effects, including birth defects, among other things. So many of the defects that are seen in people could be caused not only by BPA, but other analogs, so you can't link that epigenetic evidence to this company specifically. Additionally, beyond even BPA analogs, chemo drugs can cause similar effects as well. So there are multiple other toxins that can create these effects. And finally, just because previous court cases have made a decision on a case similar does not mean that this case should be decided similarly. It's kind of a fallacy to think that just because a previous case decided in one way, the same logic stands. Since then, there's been new evidence, new studies that perhaps would change the outcome of that court case were it done